want to tell you this morning a story about when my grandpa passed away and how it changed how I viewed my dad from that point on. My grandpa passed when I believe I was 16 years old. It might have been 15, but I think I was 16. And I remember it was me and my dad were at home. I'm not sure where everybody else was. But we were just piddling around the house and a call came in. And I remember just hearing my dad's voice was very excited and worried. And he was asking questions like, where is he? Is he still alive? Asking questions like this. So I ran up and tried to understand what was going on. And he told me that Grandpa had had a heart attack and he was in the hospital to get ready. And so I got dressed, and by the time I was dressed and ready to go, my aunt pulled up in the front. And we ran out to the car, and my dad jumped in the driver's seat. And we took off so fast and drove so fast. My grandpa lived about an hour away from us that I thought we were going to die that day too. I remember being in the back seat and being quiet. My aunt was just up there just crying. And my dad had this stern, determined, hard look on his face. And he was driving this car faster than I'd ever seen a car driven. And finally, we were going to Sherman, Texas from Dallas. A motorcycle cop turned on the lights, and we heard that. And I saw my dad sink in the seat, and he pulled over and he got out of the car. And I don't know what he said to this cop, but suddenly my dad got back in the car, and this policeman and somebody else joined him in front of us, and they drove in front of us, and drove just as fast, but now we had a police escort. And that in itself, I thought was a real beautiful thing to see this cop. My dad must have told him this was the last time he might see his father. And it's kind of a human thing that happened, I guess, that the cop, of course, understood and jumped in front of him and drove him to the hospital. I don't know if they would do that these days. But we raced to the hospital, and my dad screeched to a stop at the ER. I was saying nothing. I was very quiet. My aunt is a wailer, and she was wailing in the front. She'd finally calmed down when we got to the ER, and she ran in the double doors, and they slid open. And it was almost as soon as she had run in, she turned back around and came out, and was just crying there in the front. And then I saw my dad. He looked at her, and then he put his head down on the wheel. And he didn't get out of the car. He just sat there. And I sat there quietly in the back, and I looked at him, and his face was very pained. He didn't make any noise, but he was crying. And I saw something in his face and his eyes that was of great pain. And I just watched him. And recently, my son's in his early to mid 20s now. But a year ago or so, he told me, I was telling him a story about something that had happened. And he looked at me kind of astonished, and he goes, wow, you just really humanized yourself a little bit more in my eyes. And it's funny how he said it, but I completely understood what he was saying. There's like this, before this time, there's like this gulf between me and my dad. I loved my dad. My dad could be a very harsh, very much of a wild animal sometimes. And then he was also this tender artist. And so I had this relationship with him that there was this huge gulf between us. And I was a teenager, and we were starting to have these fights, and things were getting very serious. In fact, I got kicked out of the house about a year after this when I was 17. And so things were very tense. And I remember that's what I thought sitting back there is I suddenly just in that moment realized my dad is just a human. And that's what my son was telling me. And it's just these little glimpses. And even though I realized that then, I've had little realizations like that over my life. And they're usually just brief little times. And it's when we kind of come together in something, like where most of the time I see my dad more humanized when I see myself in him. And I go, oh gosh, would I finally see that he's not that much different from me? But from that time on, that year, even though we were still having these teenage, I was barking fights and things would blow up every once in a while. I started seeing my dad different. And I don't know if he changed, but I changed in how I wanted to know him. Because after that event, I realized, and going through the funeral and everything, what I came away with was, a sadness about losing my grandpa, but more so a deep realization. Of course, I knew this, and we all know this, but these times when somebody passes away are so important because it just cuts through all of the meat down to the bone of I'm going to have this same day sometime in the future, and it's going to be my dad, and I won't have him anymore. And I remember thinking this, but not really thinking it, but feeling it and knowing that life is short and that I need to do whatever I can to know my dad. And the reason I was so, I wanted to know him, and that I made it actually a actual goal in my life to know my dad is because I would hear, kids hear everything. And I don't remember exactly what was talked about. And it usually wasn't to me. My dad talked very kindly about his father to me and told good stories about the war and stuff. But I remember leaving events and my mom and my dad talking in the front seat and hearing things that their relationship wasn't good. That I knew that they had this gulf between each other that had never healed, and that added to even more of the humanizing of my father at that time because I had this gulf with my dad. I didn't feel like he could hear me, and I couldn't. And I knew intuitively, I don't know if I knew it so so much where I could state it out loud that I couldn't hear him either. That he was trying to be something but something in me wouldn't even let him be that. And so, I tried on that year after that to, even though I had a job, I was working at a tire shop changing tires. My dad had a job then, but he did all these side jobs painting, and I would volunteer to go with him. And I volunteered as much as I could that one year. And that's how these events, these big, someone dying can have an impact, but it didn't last. Like I said, I got kicked out about a year after this. But for that year, my 16th year, and a little bit into my 17th year, I remember just volunteering. If he had a side job on the weekend, I wanted to be with him. And our relationship changed. And I think it was more so of how I was reacting to him. I wanted to know him. And what he was at that time was a man that wanted to teach me everything he knew about painting and about craftsmanship and about good work and work ethic and about how to drink your coffee at the paint shop. And, he had all these things he wanted to teach me at that time. And I was very open. I'm very glad, everybody's going to pass. And I'm glad for what came out of this because I had this year or maybe two where I worked with my dad, but I worked with him with this just at the top of my mind that I want what you have to give me right now. And it changed our relationships. The blow-ups we had were just very natural, me acting like a teenager and messing up the entire house and not being respectful, my brain kind of was like marshmallows in my head, and I would, cause all kinds of problems around the house. And so even after I was kicked out of the house, it didn't stop me. Now I visited my dad from wherever I was living, and would sit and talk to him. And I wanted to know everything. And it just so happened that he was on this medication at the time that one of the side effects is that he talked a lot. So I got a lot in those eras, and my mind was open to listening to it. And strangely, as time goes on, here I am almost 50 and my dad's in his 70s, and we still have this gulf. And I've recognized it in my own life with my son. And it's not something that can easily be walked across. I think life is walking across it. And I think the end, the great divorce when we leave this place is when some of it is healed and a lot of it becomes clear. But here in this realm, I don't know if I will be able to get across that gulf. Here I am, almost 50, and I feel like I know my dad less than I knew him back then. But my wife's father just passed, and she's going through just a great change in her life, a reshifting of all of her thoughts of life and of herself and of her family and what life is about. And so, I see that these times, as much as I don't look forward to these times, and I see my son and my children, my daughter, going through that day with me. And I think that there's something in it that is necessary for some reason for us to really stop and know each other, and know that have this brief reminder that life is sweet, it's short. Even the people that we don't get along with and that we don't understand, there will be a time where it might become very clear to you who they were.
Goodbye watches that hang from an old chain. Goodbye John Wayne. Goodbye angels. Goodbye devils. You're looking more and more the same. Goodbye Oreos. Goodbye steel toes. Goodbye JFK. Goodbye Bonnie. Goodbye Clyde. I hear you had a rough day. Did he wake up one morning to see that old watch had ticked away? And he'd heard it all before, so there was nothing I could say, I guess. But goodbye, so goodbye Playboys, goodbye Christmas toys, goodbye silhouette, framed by the old TV and the cherry called easy. That's where we slept. Goodbye grandpas, goodbye grandsons, goodbye